Welcome back to Meet the Authors. I'm really happy to have with us today Greg Friedlander. Greg Friedlander, author, has got some tremendous books. Welcome, Greg.
Good to be here.
So I want to tell you about Greg. I'm going to let him introduce himself, but I just skimmed through these books. He's got 7 books out, and they're just amazing. Now, the reason that I'm particularly interested in, I was actually a physics major. My father was a physicist, worked on the atom bomb, and I was a physicist until I sort of got lost in some of the concepts and decided I'd end up with electrical engineering. And now I'm back to my old haunts. Now, the basis of this book, the whole theory is energy and space. The relationship is energy equals mass times the speed of light. And I just want you to try to explain to me and to our audience how this works. What are the concepts?
Well, most of physics looks at space as if it's some sort of mystery. And a long time ago, they used to talk about space as if it was filled with ether. And they did a test, which was a defective test for reasons that I'm going to explain, where they couldn't find the ether because they couldn't find the flow that was interrupting the flow of light through a beam. And so they said, well, there must not be any ether. And what my theory basically holds is that we have this formula that everybody accepts, that energy and mass are the same thing, which is an incredibly bizarre concept, sitting here today to think that we solid beings are the same things as energy. But it gets even weirder because you can take that same concept back and you can say we're the same thing as energy. Energy is the same thing as photonic light, which is particle type light, and that's the same thing as space. And it turns out that space is the same as something else, but that's a little bit beyond what you can cover in a television show. But if you want to understand how this concept works, it's fairly simple because space exists in a dimension-free and a time-free environment. There's no time in space and there's no dimension. We perceive dimension because we're dimensional beings, and also because to some extent space is given dimension by mass, but space is dimensionless. And what
So I mean, I'm going to have to interrupt you here.
No, go ahead, that's fine.
When I think of space, I think of very specific dimensions. There's 3 dimensions. I mean, we learned in school, you're going to have point for 1 dimension, you have line for 2 dimension. I guess point is 0 dimensions, line's 1 dimension, a page is 2 dimensions. And I've read a lot of science fiction about 2-dimensional. And 3rd dimension is space with like a box, and 4th dimension is time. So you have to have these dimensions to have space.
Well, let's talk about time first. We got to get rid of time because time is the great misleader of all physicists.
It's also my great misleader too, man. I never get things done on time.
Exactly. If you look at what we know about time, if you start to go very fast, like energy moves very fast, the speed of light, time disappears. And if you look at time in a high gravity field, like in a black hole, time disappears again. And the reason for that is because time is an effect. It's not an actual thing. And that's the big misconception, according to my theory. And everything I say is according to my theory. And the math is in the book. So if somebody says, well, that sounds bizarre, Greg, prove it to me, I say read the books. Or stop by my office, I'll explain it to you. Maybe.
Well, that's good.
but we know that time disappears during those time frames. And so what that tells me, and it's sort of mathematically proven, is that time is just an effect. If you go back and look at where we're at, and then you look at a black hole has 4 dimensions, and we live in 3 dimensions. And the reason we see a black hole shrink to a point is because it's stretching out in that 4th dimension that we can't see. There's a book called Flatlanders, if you ever want to, which was also written by a mathematician. If you ever want to understand how this dimensional viewpoint looks, you can read that book. But so we're sitting here in 3 dimensions. That's what matters to us. So if we look back from where we're at to energy exists sort of in 2 dimensions. Photons exist in 1 dimension, and space exists with no dimensions. So why do we see dimensions in space?
That's really complicated.
Well, it sounds complicated, but it's actually just a stepwise process, just like E equals mc squared is a ratio. this is a ratio going backwards. We're just following that ratio back to where it begins.
So I know you're getting into your theory here, but I want to sort of sidetrack you a little
Okay,
bit
good.
and actually talk about your books. So you brought in some. I'm lifting them up here for the camera. Up, there's 3 of the 7 here. And I must admit this one is my favorite, The Science of Nostradamus. Put a little camera on me here. Science of Nostradamus. This is fun. This talks about Socrates and all the development of the theories. And then these are much more like physics books. Right here, you hold
That's
the
right.
book, your books.
Yeah, and let me tell you, there's physics is a process. I didn't sit down and come up with this entire theory. I have 8 books, all under the title Algorithm Universe Theory. And if somebody says, well, I want to read one, which one should I read? I would say 1, 2, 7, and 8. And then eventually I'll bring the other books up to the same level that those are. But if you said, well, I don't really want to know anything about physics, I just want to read something that's fun, that sort of talks about this same concept, then what you could do is you could say, well, read The Science of Nostradamus. What it does is it takes this theory and it says, is it possible to predict the future? And while not necessarily answering that question exactly, it does present it in a fictional context.
So you're going to read a little bit from this book for us, are you?
Right, right. And again, this is sort of a highly fictionalized historical fiction book that covers the development of this theory. So I'm just going to pick out first a paragraph that talks about the science behind it. The first thing I discovered was that history and dimension could not blindly be accepted for what the main body of physicists thought they were. One of the last things I began to determine was that there was a model that must exist. Since the direction of gravity is in a spiral, I must look for spiral models that might provide some clue as to what I am missing. And in fact, that's what actually occurred when I was developing it. And fun thing about this, this theory's 2,500 years old. A guy by the name of Parmenides, which somebody who's a lot smarter than me told me about this. They were reading my work and they said, that looks like Zeno's paradox. And Zeno wrote these paradoxes, and one of them was that if you shoot an arrow at somebody, it should never hit them because it should go halfway, and then it should go halfway, and it should go halfway, and it would never hit them. And that's actually a very interesting paradox. It's something that's worth thinking about.
I don't recommend trying it, though, in your backyard.
No, it's not something you want to try. But it's a solvable paradox, and that's one of the things that I work through, both in the fictional version of it and the other version, is how you would resolve a paradox like that.
So how did you get all your interest in physics? You're a lawyer and you're a patent attorney. How did you get so involved in this esoteric top field?
Well, you know, I was reading a book by Hawkins on
Stephen Hawkins.
Yeah. On the universe. And I was trying to reconcile that book with some quote from Einstein, a specific quote, which was, the only reason for time is so that everything doesn't happen at once. And Hawkins' book was on hologram theory, which says that we're all living in a hologram. And there's a whole body of physics that talks about the fact that we live in a simulation, which is sort of like saying we live in a computer program. And to some extent, that's very similar to what my argument is, so it's not totally unique. What I do is I provide a model for that simulation.
Well, this has been really interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading some more of your books. You've sent them to me by email, and Greg's books and all the books of our guests and my own books are available on my website. Put my website up there. And just a reminder to check us out here and on Facebook and on YouTube, where all the individual episodes are available. So, Greg, thanks so much for coming.
Thanks so much.
We're glad to have you, and we're looking forward to next time having more authors here on Meet the Authors. Be sure and tune in. Thanks for coming.